What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. The Beyond UX Design shop is open. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some of my favorite UX and software related quotes. Get yourself a copy of Beyond UX Design, Master Your Craft Beyond Pixels and Prototypes. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/shop and get your print on. This week's episode is brought to you by Wix Studio. If you're thinking about redoing your portfolio or kicking off a new website project, listen up. I only have 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprise. So here are a few things that you can do from start to finish in 30 seconds or less on Studio. You can adapt your designs for every device with responsive AI. You can jump seamlessly between front end and back end. You can speed up projects with an AI code assistant. You can start a design library. You can reuse full stack apps and UI components across multiple sites. So time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/Wix to start creating today. This week's episode is sponsored by Jeff White's UX Storytelling Toolkit. Jeff's toolkit offers actionable insights on storytelling for UX designers. Jeff walks you through how to present work to clients and stakeholders, how to craft compelling case studies, and how to improve portfolio presentations for job interviews. Jeff's approach goes beyond your basic once-upon-a-time kind of stuff. And because I know this course will help you out so much, I partnered with Jeff to give everybody listening a 10% discount if you use the code BeyondUX when you check out. So head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/storytelling. This up. Oh, I'll fix this later. Anyway, I just rewrote this script today and I did not read it before. Anyway, whatever. I'll skip it. I'll come back to it. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Rodney, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, and Marty for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get rough transcripts and exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're released. And you get instant access right now to the video archives for as little as $5 a month. For more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing here, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. So the interesting thing about UX design today in software is it's global. You could build an app in one country and anyone from anywhere in the world can use that service. But how do you know you're designing for the right experience if you don't have the context of that particular culture? So I've got my friend Ruby Pryor on today. She has lived in Australia. She's lived in Southeast Asia and all over the place. And she's got a lot of experience designing for various cultures. So we're going to talk all about that today. How you can take these ideas and start designing and make sure you're designing an inclusive experience for anyone around the world. So I'm so excited to have Ruby on. Where's your bio, Ruby? What did I do with it? There it is. All right. Ruby Pryor is the founder of Rex, a UX research and strategic design consulting firm. Ruby has worked in design and customer experience for a decade across Australia and Asia. Her experience includes working for Boston Consulting Group, Grab, and Noose Group. Did I pronounce that right? Noose? Nouse Group. Sorry, okay. Her experience includes working for Boston Consulting Group, Grab, and Nouse Group. She's spoken at UX conferences in 5 countries, appeared on multiple podcasts, and been interviewed on Channel News Asia. That's impressive. Now you can add Beyond UX to your list, Ruby. I'm excited about that. So, Ruby, welcome to Beyond UX Design. I am so excited to have you on. How's it going?
It's going great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. And I feel like the fact it's my evening, your morning, we're already in a really kind of global situation here.
That's right. We are. Yeah. It's funny. I always feel bad trying to ask people from East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, all those places to come on the show because I personally can't call you at 9 p.m. because my kids would be yelling and screaming in the back trying to go to sleep. It's impossible. So I always have to, I'm like, look, I'd love to have you on. I just, the time sucks. But I really appreciate you taking time out of your night, not even your day. It's like bedtime for you to come on and hang out. So thanks for coming on. So I read a little bit about your bio, but you've got a really interesting story. You just moved to Bangkok. You were in Singapore before. You're from Australia, so you lived all over the place, a bunch of different countries. Tell us a little bit about you and your experience, and how'd you get to this point where you're starting to understand how all these various cultures work, and you can design really effective experiences.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited that I get to be here and that we've got to make it work.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I started my career in Australia, and I worked in consulting firms. I worked in market research, then I worked in a management consulting firm and started to specialize in human-centered design and service design, which was gaining a lot of traction at that time. At the end of 2018, my partner and I decided to move to Singapore. When I decided to move, I'd never even visited before, but sometimes you just
Really?
gotta jump in with both
YOLO.
feet.
YOLO.
Exactly. I think it's for the plot. That's what we say now.
There it is.
So yeah, made that move over, and it's just been such an enriching experience, I would say, to live outside of Australia. I was born and raised in Melbourne, Australia. I lived my whole life there, and moving to Asia has been really the first time that I've lived outside of my home country for any extended period of time. So it was 5.5 years. I lived in Singapore, and then just about 6 weeks ago, I moved over to Thailand. And despite being geographically quite close together, there are still lots of differences between living in Singapore and in Thailand. And this is the first country that I've really lived in where English is not the primary language. And so that's adding a whole nother dimension to my own experiences. And I really think that once I left Australia, I started to understand Australian culture. And I think when you are born and raised in that culture, sometimes it can be hard to kind of see it for what it is. But once you leave, you have this experience of realizing and coming to terms, I think, with the fact that a lot of the things that I thought were more or less universal were actually quite culturally determined. And realizing that those things can appear actually really differently in different places around the world has been really eye-opening.
Yeah. No, I'm really excited to have you on a chat about this. So a few weeks back, I had my buddy Joseph on, and we talked about the different cultures and stuff, but as it relates to Northern Europe versus Southern Europe and North America. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about some of these differences between, Australia, which obviously has a lot of Western influence, technically not in the West, but I think often Australia is lumped in with the West, quote unquote. But it's interesting to kind of think about Western culture versus Eastern culture and all this stuff. So I'm really excited to chat about this today. So something that I'm really curious about, just from the beginning, you grew up in Australia, you spent most of your life in Australia. What was that kind of, from a UX perspective, what was that kind of like moving now to a place like Singapore in Southeast Asia and having to do UX work from, it seems to me at least, like very different cultures. I'm curious what that experience was like for you, and I don't know what kind of things happened. I mean, I feel like we could talk about this just alone for like an hour, but
Yeah.
I'm curious. I'm sure you had some interesting anecdotes there.
Oh, for sure. Huge change. Like, I think we talk about culture shock as this thing that happens, but I think sometimes talking about it in the specifics can feel kind of difficult. Like, and I think the thing with UX, as with all work, is that it happens inside of organizations, and organizations are made up of people. And one of the small things, I guess, that I noticed really quickly was in Australia, people start work super early. Like, it's very common, I think, for people to be in the office, like definitely by 9. Having 9 a.m. meeting is like not that unusual, I would say.
Sure.
Whereas
Okay.
in Southeast Asia, I would say like that was much less common. People would start work a little bit later, but they would also finish work later. So just like the whole
Oh,
kind of
okay.
work day was just shifted a little bit later. And I think that
Interesting.
was one of
Okay.
the first moments of coming to terms with like, oh, I thought just like the corporate world, right? Like people did this thing
Hmm.
in a certain way, and like this is just how the workday was. But I didn't realize, I guess, how culturally determined actually that was. And I
Hmm.
think keeping things like this in mind is really important when we're thinking about designing organizations or designing services and experiences, right? Because if you're having a customer call center and you're thinking about like what are the hours that call center is available and what are the implications of making those the hours of that contact center what they are, both for your customers but also for your staff. So even something like that, like when different places tend to have ups and downs in their workday, breaks in their workday, starts and ends to their workday. I think that was one of the first things that really stood out to me. I think also, secondly, like what's always really interesting when you move to a new country is you have to set up a new life. You have to do things like get a new bank account. You have to interact with the government. You've got to find somewhere to rent. You've got to find an internet provider. Maybe you need to set up insurances. Like all of these things that often I think people do pretty infrequently. You're hit with this huge kind of workload in your own personal life, right? And I think you get exposed really quickly to some of the underlying assumptions in those countries about how products and services should function that then you need to take on board as someone who is designing products and services in those countries as well. So, for example, in Singapore, they have this thing called SingPass, and SingPass is like provided by the government. It's a government service, and it's kind of like an online hub, I guess, for interacting with the government. It's got your identity verification inside, and you use SingPass when you're interacting with pretty much any part of the government, and also when you're doing things that involve KYC. So anytime you're applying for a credit card, anytime you're opening a new bank account, that can all be streamlined so quickly through SingPass. And being a user of SingPass meant that when I was working, for example, I would work in the financial, like the fintech part of Grab when I worked in Singapore. I knew what that was about, right? Like I understood that this would be an assumption of folks in Singapore when interacting with any kind of financial services provider, that SingPass would be part of that experience. So I think my ability then to anticipate that, to be able to converse in that way during UX research sessions was just so much greater because I was living in that reality as well. And I think there's just so much benefit from having folks who have like boots on the ground in those cultural contexts when you are working for a global organization that is trying to design for a lot of these different countries, when you have people who have that lived experience. And obviously mine is a shallow lived experience compared to people that kind of grew up there. But I think it really helps in terms of our own consideration for how we're going to design those, and ultimately makes you kind of a more considered designer in your own approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you bring up a really great point too, that designing for these various cultures, a lot of times when you are designing for various cultures, you're also working with a team who lives in that culture. And so it's not just designing for the users, it's also how do you design, I guess for lack of a better term, how do you design your work experience to build that software so that you can ultimately release it. And it's interesting when you talk about like working different times. I guess it makes sense. I wonder if there's like because, Singapore is financial capital kind of in a way, right? A lot of people from, Europe and North America will deal with Singapore. Do they start late, you think, because they're dealing with those other time zones? So they're trying to align perhaps maybe with that,
Totally. Like, absolutely. That could be a factor. Singapore is such an international city like that. Like, nearly everyone I feel like is always on calls with other parts of the world and kind of juggling those things. So
Yeah.
that totally could be a factor.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned, like in Australia, they start really early. And you said 9. I was like, wow, that's early.
I mean,
because like in the States, for me, like everybody kind of starts at 9 o'clock. And, I used to work for a big global conglomerate, and we would start 8:30 in the morning sometimes, 8 o'clock meetings. I've had meetings at 7 a.m. and,
no,
which is
totally.
insane. I always
think
decline
it's
them, but.
like
Yeah.
my litmus test is like how taboo is a 9 a.m. meeting or how taboo is an 8:30 a.m. meeting, right? And in Australia, like, yeah, I think my first job, my official hours were 8:30 to 5:30 in Australia.
Oh, wow.
And that was like completely fine and like normal. And I think, yeah, when I say like everyone's in the office by 9, like if you're coming into the office after 9 in Australia, I feel like my experience was pre-COVID. So like maybe things have changed, but
Right.
it definitely felt like people were in by 9. A lot of folks were in between 8 and 8:30. And there's always a cohort that comes in earlier than that. Whereas I just feel like that bell curve, right, is just like shifted a little bit when it comes to Singapore. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of interesting to think about in post-COVID too, and being in the office versus not. So one of the things that's kind of interesting when we think about this idea of global design, right? We always say, we're not our users. Obviously, if you don't live in a place like Southeast Asia, but you're releasing software for a Southeast Asian culture, we're sort of lumping all those together. But obviously, you mentioned this, Singapore, very different from Thailand, very different from Vietnam, very different from Laos, very different from, parts of India and everywhere else, which are also, close proximity. You can't do that without some form of research. So I'm curious from your perspective, like, how do you go about like understanding those things? You could move there and immerse yourself in the culture, kind of ethnography, I guess. But how do you do that if you're remote? Like, is there ways that you found, your framework or something where you could talk about maybe that's kind of helped get to a point where you can confidently design and understand, well, I guess understand first before you design those cultures?
Yeah, I mean, tough ask for sure. Like there's no substitute, I guess, for experiencing those cultures yourself or working with people who have primary experience of those cultures. I think that's always going to be a really rich way to do it. Of course, like user research, there's lots of different ways that that can help in that process. And I think doing like in-depth interviews, even if they are remote, is still something that's incredibly useful for coming to terms with what some of those differences might be. Enriching your own exposure to different cultures in any way that you can, be that like reading books, watching movies, like social media accounts that come from creators in lots of different contexts. Like something I really notice is that my algorithm will be different when I'm in Asia versus when I'm back home in Australia. I feel like it must be tagged geographically. And I
Wow,
notice
okay.
that
Never
like
thought about
different creators get really surfaced when I'm here versus back home. So I don't know if there's a way to like spoof that or to deliberately like follow on TikTok a bunch of creators from the country that you're interested in and people living there, like not people, I guess, traveling there, because obviously that's like a very different kind of experience. But any way that you can kind of vicariously build that understanding, I think is really good. In terms of frameworks that I think are very helpful, a really important book here for me was The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. It is a sensational and really important book for helping understand different cultures. And she has a framework with a number of elements. I think there's about 7 different elements to it, and they are different spectrums along which she plots different countries. So she's done a whole bunch of research, and the book is filled with amazing personal anecdotes from her own time, as well as the results from her research. And I think there are a couple of these cultural dimensions that have very much surfaced for me in my own life, but also in my practice of UX. So one of those is high context cultures and low context cultures. So high context cultures are more indirect. There's more reading in between the lines. There's more use of things like metaphor in communication. Low context cultures tend to be very direct. They tend to say things exactly how they mean them. And there's no room left for interpretation. USA is very, very low context. It's like the lowest context culture I think that there is.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Extremely direct.
Okay. Yeah.
I always thought this was maybe an example of it, right? How Americans say like eyeglasses, horseback riding, tuna fish. Like there is no room for interpretation that I mean anything else other than what I have said. I'm not riding a horse anywhere else. My glasses are definitely on my eyes, and the tuna is definitely a fish. Like it is extremely explicit what that means.
Yeah.
At the other end of the spectrum, Japan is an incredibly high context culture. And they say that to speak Japanese well, you have to read the air, that there's a lot that is unsaid that is still communicated. And for me, in my own kind of life, Australia is down the lower context end of the spectrum, and most places in Southeast Asia are up the higher end context of the spectrum. And generally, Erin Meyer says in this book, what's really important is not necessarily absolutely where a country kind of lies on the spectrum, but more where do you relatively sit to the country that you're interacting with? Because you could come from a sort of higher context culture, but if you, like Singapore is higher context than Australia, right? But a Singaporean interacting with a Japanese person would still find Japan to be much higher context. So it's all about kind of that variation. And I think, how does that manifest, right, when it comes to UX? So my hypothesis when it comes to UX research is that it means that the likelihood that someone says very specifically and directly exactly what is happening in terms of their own experience is lower. Like, when we're taught research methods, I feel like culture is chronically under discussed, to be honest, and we need to bring more of this fluency into our practice. But one of the things that you're often told is like, you really got to get people to speak from their own experience. And you'll have seen this, right, in research sessions where people say something like, oh, I think people would find this really confusing, or I don't really think people would like that. And when I worked in Singapore, I was hearing this a lot. And my instinct as a researcher was always like, let's not talk about other people. Let's talk about you. What is it that you want? And I was really reflecting on this, and I'm like, but is that just a context difference? Are they actually saying that they don't like it or that they find it confusing, but they're just saying it in a different way that I'm not understanding because I've come from a culture where I expect you to say extremely explicitly, I don't like this product because of the way this interface is designed and the fact that this hierarchy doesn't make sense or whatever. Like, I wondered if there was like a mismatch there in terms of context. Is it that I'm expecting a level of explicit declaration that is not likely to actually happen in a high context culture? And I feel like elements like this are really important to at least be cognizant of when designing these processes, because then we can maybe do something with that better.
Yeah. Well, it's something worth pointing out. I think it's obvious, but these cultures are not monoliths, and just because you live, just like you said, you live in a certain culture doesn't mean you are a representative of the average. What's interesting, I never thought about this, is if you mentioned, viewing TikTok or these places where influencers are sharing information and stuff from those various cultures, you could, I mean, it's interesting because culture is not geographically isolated, right? Culture can be shared digitally through communication and things like that when you think about it. So you can not get, you can't walk down the street and get, it's the see the sights and the smells of the local fishmonger and things like that. But you certainly can get a sense for language and how people communicate and speak through something like social media or TikTok in your example. And I don't think I ever considered that until just now, which is really interesting to kind of think about. There's also sort of this idea, though, and I don't know what it's like in Asia. I imagine it's similar, but in the United States, for instance, the cultures across generations and the way a baby boomer interacts with people and how they communicate versus Gen Z and Gen Alpha, even very, very, very different, even within that same geographic region. And so it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've experienced that with generational divides. Is that a similar kind of thing in Asia that you see in North America and Europe, or is that a cultural thing maybe that's different?
Yeah,
It's probably hard to answer that question.
No, I think all of these things exist and manifest, in different ways as well. Something that I would hear folks talk about in Singapore is the sandwich generation, which is more of a life stage, I guess, rather than a cohort. But this idea of folks who are at the same time supporting their parents and their children, and dealing with both of those things, because I think some norms around things like filial piety are different in Asia than they might be in the West, and expectations around supporting parents might look different, and the kind of demands then that are placed on folks' time. And then from there, I guess the kind of like services and products and constraints and pain points and all these things that kind of flow from there is also something really, really worth kind of taking note of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so that's just something to maybe know. Just recap. I think it's important is geography plays a part in this, obviously, but then within the geography there are sub tiers of cultures that are very different, and I'm sure it's similar. I mean, this is the way in the United States even within those geographies there are different cultures, right? The South versus the North, or the West Coast versus the East Coast. And, somebody from Alabama, Southern Alabama, is going to be very different from somebody in New York City, even though they both live within the United States and they might be the same exact generation, the same age. They're still very, very different. So, it's I always think about this when I go to a place like get Indian food, and you go and you order Indian food and there's this tiny little menu of maybe 15, 20 dishes. But when you think about India, I imagine East Asia is very similar. India, how do you like combine a monolith like India with all these different cultures and subcultures and languages even, they all speak different languages within one country that is India. But like one Indian curry dish, to like represent all of India. And I kind of like to equate that with, just users as well when you're trying to design something for, the Indian market or the Chinese market even. It's so hard to generalize. I often think about what's an American restaurant in India look like? Does it just have like hamburgers? What about pizza? What about hot dogs? What about barbecue? What about nachos? What about, all these like various things, but it's all under one umbrella. It's kind of funny.
I find it super fascinating actually in the context of a service like Uber Eats, right? If you look at Uber Eats in a Western country and you look at the categories of food that they have, there might be a category Asian food. And that to me is very interesting when you think about the massive diversity that exists in Asia. It's 4 or 5 billion people, the number of different cultures, cuisines, etc., Asian food. But when you're in Singapore, right, you would see like stalls sometimes that sold Western food. So
what is that?
It happens both ways, right? It's all about like what's the expectation of that culture, and the kind of food that you'll see in this like in a hawker center in Singapore is kind of like an open air sort of food market with lots of different types of food, and they would often have a Western food stall, and it would sell like fish and chips, baked beans, maybe like pork chops, something like this. So like,
okay.
Yeah,
so
like
funny.
that same kind of, the information architecture and the kind of assumptions folks hold in their mind, the way they categorize information. And like that does manifest in our product designs and the kind of choices we make about what information is communicated to what level of detail in what context, I think is super interesting.
All right, so let's dig into that a little bit if we can. I know we don't have too much time. We've already talked a lot about like just generalizing, but if we are designers and we are tasked with designing for these cultures, where does one start? We talked a little bit about UX research. Obviously, you mentioned a book that I think it's worth reading books, but maybe we all can't move there. We all can't, and embrace this ethnography and dig deep. But what are some considerations for this global audience if we were to end up in a job that required it? Where do we start?
I think the first thing is acknowledging that you are building a global product unless you are very specifically geographically limiting it. And I feel like a lot of this starts just because the mindset is not necessarily there that this is a global product. And I'm very sympathetic to startups, for example. You're in a really resource constrained environment. Like, how can you necessarily have this really global perspective all of the time? Like, it's tough. You have to make trade-offs. I totally get that. But I think there are some considerations that we can kind of bring to the fore when we're looking at this kind of global perspective. So one thing that always I'm very conscious of is how we talk about time and how we design for time. This is something I was always sensitive of, having been born and raised in the Southern Hemisphere. So you would hear people talk a lot of the time like, oh, it's coming in summer or it's happening in autumn. I'm like, well, who's
True,
summer?
yeah.
Because
right.
right now it's August as we're recording this. So in Australia, it is winter. Whereas a lot of the content that I'm reading online, particularly on LinkedIn, which is my primary social media, you have so much content. I hope everyone's enjoying their summer break. Now we're all coming back from our summer break and I'm thinking, okay, interesting. But I mean, this happens in product design as well. It happens in the way that brands will go out and communicate to their audiences in things like email newsletters, in things like conference landing pages. I'll say tickets coming on sale in fall. And I'm like, it just takes a second to kind of conceive of when that might be. Also in the date format itself, different countries around the world order those things differently. And I always find it quite fascinating that despite the date format used in the US, month, day, year, being absolutely the minority globally, so many products have that as the default. And what can be super frustrating is they have it and they don't even necessarily explain it. Like, once you filled it in, those labels disappear because they were inline labels. And then you're left being like, wait, was this a month, day, year? Or was this a day, month, year field? And it wouldn't surprise me if like lots of people are messing up their date of birth in airline bookings or things like this because of the way these things are structured. So I think like when it comes to like UI design and UX design, that's really, really important. But what I mean also by this consideration, right, is like, for example, I love Love is Blind to the point where I want to watch the episodes like immediately once they drop. And I find it so frustrating with the Netflix interface. It will say like episode available like August 24. And I wake up on August 24 and I go to look at the episode and it's still not available.
12 hours behind or
right,
ahead. Or,
exactly. I live in the future and I'm waiting for Netflix to catch up with me. But there's no countdown timer. There's no like dropping at blah, 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 your time zone, or even dropping at like blah, 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 Netflix time zone. Just nothing. Like, and so you're just left there being like, is this a bug? Does this make sense? Or Googling like, when does Netflix release shows? So I think this is what I mean when I say like, you got to just acknowledge that it's happening. And then from there, we can take the steps to do something about it in the design.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, I would imagine, and I've never looked at Netflix outside of the United States, but it's bizarre to me that that is not a consideration, because it seems very easy to localize that and have localization in various things. I'm sure they're changing languages. Obviously, Australian will be English, but why couldn't you localize that as well? The time, the date, the release, the countdown. We just had a really awesome conversation with Emily Anderson not long ago. We talked a lot about edge cases, and clearly from Netflix's perspective, that's an edge case. But when you think about a global piece of software like Netflix, that edge case is probably pretty damn predominant across the globe, especially on the opposite side of the world where it's a 12-hour difference and you are living in the future. And it's kind of interesting. I find that fascinating that that Netflix did not consider that. That blows my mind that a company like Netflix, who touts its usability and UX and all that, never considered that. That's insane.
They also use American date formats, so they've got a few points of consideration.
This is something I want to talk about, because I used to work for a big, large global conglomerate, and this conglomerate had offices and shops all over the world, but it was very, very, very American centric, right? We didn't localize language. Everyone had to speak English. We had some shops where, the repair manuals for these components, these jet engine components, had to be translated into Chinese or Portuguese in Brazil or Hungarian and stuff like that. But for the most part, the interface was never localized. It was never something we took into consideration. And always we would get people confused constantly about date formats because we would use two-digit dates. And obviously in America, we put month, day, year. But in most other countries around the world, they put day, month, year. So, 0102 2024, is that January 2nd or is it February 1st? And constantly people would screw that up, and we'd end up with all kinds of just, even for the business, I mean, this is something to consider beyond just the experience. The data was bad because the data was wrong because someone would input the wrong thing simply because nobody accounted for it instead of putting, 0102 instead of, Jan 02 or Feb 01 or whatever. So it's just, I don't know, I experienced that firsthand. It's just even kind of goes beyond the user experience, and I think it moves towards, business value. That's maybe a good way to kind of like push that. So it's kind of interesting. I want to talk a little bit about this idea though, and I think this applies directly when we talk about global. I talk a lot about service design. I know you talk a lot about service design, and what I love about service design is, you go up a level, you zoom out, you think past just the simple interface and the button and the border radius and all that stuff, and you think, what happens before, what happens after, what's the larger context? And as I'm thinking about you talking about, global design, something that kind of strikes me is this idea how important something like service design would be in a global context for you to understand those things outside of the interface. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and your experience there, and how designers can start to maybe think more like a service designer, even if that's not really your job.
Yeah, I think this is such a great point. And I think service design, as you say, it's all about understanding that context, and it's all about understanding that ecosystem. So I think when you're doing that design work and particularly doing that research, it's about starting your questions at the right moment and almost like going back far enough in time to really understand what the users are doing and how they're coming across your product and how that product or that service is going to sit within the ecosystem that you are trying to enter or that you play in as an organization. And I think particularly things around like how people find out about stuff, how are people doing their research, where is that awareness coming from? Like these types of questions, I think, to kick off your projects are really critical. And I think they're often present, but not always maybe given as much due consideration as they need to be. Like, for example, in Thailand, something that's really important to my daily life that was never important until 6 weeks ago is the app called Line, Line. And all communication kind of happens online. When I want to interact with a business, a lot of that is happening over Line.
Online.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a clever title. Anyway, I love that.
It's pretty great.
Yeah.
And, in Singapore, for example, it was all like WhatsApp, and you do a lot of business WhatsApp and stuff. But when I left Australia at the end of 2018, like WhatsApp wasn't even really that present in Australia. But if you came to Singapore and your business like didn't support WhatsApp, or if you're in Thailand, your business didn't really support Line, like that might be a real consideration. That's really something to consider. So I think having enough time to really do that kind of deep dive with your users and understand more about that ecosystem, more about what's happening up front, in terms of particularly that kind of awareness and research piece that the consumer is doing, can go a long way, I think, to help that thinking.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm curious, do you have any specific tactics maybe for a designer or researcher even who might not be local? How do you get that perspective of somebody in a completely different culture, a completely different geographical location? Do you have any experience there? It seems pretty hard just to get users even in your own country. So like the idea of going and trying to find people, are there services maybe that like hire people? I'm just curious how that works. What are your thoughts? How do you do that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are a lot of recruitment agencies that can help with this kind of stuff. Like you have the brief, you have the criteria, the same way you would recruit in your own country. Like there's a lot of these that will help you recruit in other countries. So I acknowledge that this is a really different thing depending on the size of organization you work for and the amount of budget that you have. If you're a small startup, often the only research you're really doing is with your own customer base, maybe through your own mailing list, maybe you're getting signups on your website, or maybe through your own social media. That might be a little bit more challenging to kind of find a very specific target audience. But you're generally more likely to get more people signing up to be part of your research if you're giving incentives that are meaningful. And that's really important. Like, be very careful that you're not giving folks and trying to incentivize folks with a voucher that they can't actually use in their own country or is
An
not
Amazon
useful.
gift
Right.
card that's not, yeah.
Right, exactly. Like, these things can just be really easy to kind of deprioritize. And then maybe have that question like, why is no one responding to this? But, they might prefer a Shopee voucher, a Lazada voucher, rather than an Amazon voucher, for example. So I think that's one thing. But if you're part of a large multinational organization that has and devotes budget to doing research and to recruiting participants externally, like, it's actually relatively straightforward, I would say, to find folks in these markets through these kind of organizations. I mean, that's a lot of the work that Rex does, is working with companies from like outside of Southeast Asia and helping do this kind of work and do this kind of research in Southeast Asia so that those companies can kind of build that understanding. Like, it's very feasible. If the organization wants to make it a priority, I really think it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm just thinking too, my experience was mostly in enterprise and in, internal applications. And, this was something that we struggled with early on, and it took kind of a blunder on our team's part to really show the value of this. But, we had 2 shops in Singapore. I can't remember if I mentioned this. We had 2 shops in Singapore, and obviously traveling to Singapore is expensive. Hotels in Singapore are expensive. Meals in Singapore are expensive. So it would have been a very expensive trip to have people go for a couple of weeks to go observe these 2 shops and, build software for them. So they skipped it. They didn't want to do it. We didn't have the budget for it. And so we released this software. We found out it wasn't going to work, basically. We had to spend about 6 months or so fixing the issues. And so what we found, and it was obvious then, that like if we had spent the $20,000 for a few people to go to Singapore for 2 weeks, we would have saved probably $500,000, if not more. And so that's something to think about, even internally. When you do work for a large multinational conglomerate and you do have these shops, you have a captive audience, and there's no reason not to spend a few $1,000s to travel and observe, because even inside of a company, and these are all the same employees of the same company, those cultures are very different. The way they work is very different. The way that they want to work is very different. And you coming in, and this has happened a lot, we try to force a process, and they're like, we're not doing that. And they wouldn't do it. And so anyway, it's just something to think about when you work for a large enterprise company. Some of you probably listening probably do. You've got that captive audience. Take advantage of that and get a free international trip out of it. You can spend some time and hang out in Singapore for a couple of weeks. But I don't know. That's just something to think about. Even if you are internal, those teams are still going to be very different, and the way they work are going to be very different, regardless if they're employees of the same company or not.
I think you raised such an important point here, Jeremy, that like people talk a lot about wanting to quantify the impact UX makes and UX research makes on an organization. And it's a tough thing to do. It can be done, but it's a tough thing to do. And I think why it's so hard is explained really well by your anecdote. Like, so much of what good UX research in particular does is avoid risk and mitigate risk. And so you're trying to quantify something that did not happen, something that you prevented. And in our lives, I feel like we're much better at celebrating cures rather than preventions. Because once there was a disaster, the person that steps in and kind of fixes it, you're like, oh yeah, wow, like they really saved the day. But the person that prevented that from happening in the first place, like that's something that can actually be very difficult, and I think can often lead a lot of researchers in particular feeling really frustrated that research is often like a quality gate in some senses, that we do it to make sure we're not releasing a product that's going to be confusing, that we're not releasing a product that's going to destroy our customer value proposition, it's going to frustrate our users, it's going to lead to churn, it's going to lead to defection, all of these things. But if you do your job well, none of those things happen. So how can you really talk about it? And I think one of the great unlocks here is exactly what you discussed. The fact that we did not build this product meant that we did not spend a certain number of weeks of person power in building that product. And that can be quantified very easily. If you know the salary, the ballpark salary of the developers, of the designers, of the PMs, and you know ballpark how long they would have spent building that product, you can multiply that together in a really straightforward manner to come up with a dollar value that you just saved that organization. And you can absolutely chalk up that impact to your research and say that you saved that company, whatever it is, like $500,000. And even better than that, if you have redirected that priority to something that launched in market that did make money, right? That's extra impact that you can claim, because there's an opportunity cost every time an organization builds anything. You've decided to build this and not this, and there's an opportunity cost that comes along with that. And by unleashing a really great product earlier, because you help redirect those priorities, like you have in fact captured that as well. And I think like we need to be much more, I don't know, like much more assertive sometimes in saying like, hey,
Yeah.
like we did that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because before that happened, and in my example, the one of the stakeholders that actually pushed us to not do the trip became a huge advocate for UX work after that. And to this day, this was probably like 8 or 9 years ago. To this day, he is an advocate for UX design because he realized how important that was. And it was sort of one of those things. I think PR people say, it was like, never let a crisis go to waste or whatever. So we took the advantage. It was like, look, see what happened? Do you see what happened? So that was honestly maybe one of the best things that happened for that product early on. And so I don't know. That was just a really interesting example. But I read this. Was it a book or an article? I tried to find it a while ago and I couldn't. But it was talking exactly about what you mentioned when someone is advocating for the prevention of something and the thing never happens. You can never point back and say, "Look, it didn't happen." See, because this happens with politicians all the time, where it's easier to show that you fixed something than it is to prevent something, and so you can't really prove it if it never happened, and so. It's very anyway. It's an interesting thing. It was a really interesting article, and I can't find it. I had this conversation not long ago with somebody, and I tried to find the article, I couldn't. But anyway, all right. So I love that. So that's really interesting, and I love that. Something that I'm kind of curious about. Let's say you've gone and you've built these things, and you've done some of this. When it comes to an international audience, I'm curious. Is there some kind of way to measure the effectiveness on a cultural level? To say, we have done a good job of accounting for cultures, or we haven't? Is there a way to do that? Is it no different than just normal UX measuring? I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is there some kind of special thing for international audiences?
This is a really fascinating question. I'm thinking about this so much because would you even measure that in the primary culture, I guess, where the thing was created? Like, how often are we actually measuring and testing and caring about, frankly, if we have developed a product that is sensitive and inclusive? And
Right,
when it
that's
comes
true.
to not just culture, but we're talking about like gender, and we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about sexuality, like all of these different things. Unfortunately, that's not always really high on the agenda of a company. At the end of the day, I feel like the way that, frankly, this would manifest is, are our metrics in these markets hitting our projected benchmarks? And if the answer is no, then I think organizations can be quite willing to open up that conversation and say like, hey, is there a way we could be more in tune with the culture here to kind of boost some of our metrics? And if not, like if the metrics are okay, I think unfortunately, rarely are organizations asking that question proactively.
Right, after the fact. Yeah, I was just thinking, let's say you're in, Western Europe, and I don't know, metrics are up, everything's great, but then in China, everything's down, it's flat. Same application, two different places. Clearly, something is off. Something to investigate and think about that. So yeah, that's really interesting. I just wonder about that too. And you make a good point. Are we even thinking about that? Generally speaking, inclusivity, things like that are often at the bottom of the list. And, very often they're seen as cost centers. But I think this goes back to the idea that, how do we as designers translate what we think is important so that a stakeholder will find value in it as well? So I'm curious, just thinking about this in general, something that I want to dig into. We talk about this, but you're going to get pushback a lot from stakeholders and other people who are, whatever, we don't need that. Maybe that's MVP2, that's second version. We'll get to it later. I'm curious, how do you promote this within your team to push for this idea? And maybe it's not much different from just general accessibility, but I'm curious what your thoughts are there. Is there some kind of tactic, some kind of way to do that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think often framing it in terms of the opportunity that exists. And I think people do this with accessibility, as you say, all of the time. When you talk about that 3% of a certain market has a certain characteristic, and when the size of that market is like 100 million or a billion people, suddenly that number is actually massive in terms of the potential opportunity of doing that and doing it right. So I think that's often the way that this discourse kind of goes, is presenting that we are missing out on capturing a certain consumer base. And that's generally something that an organization is really going to want to care about, is going to want to listen to. I think particularly when it comes to Southeast Asia, there's a bunch of these economies as well with a really large young population. Philippines, for example, has a lot of young folks, really large population. So there's a lot of like potential, I guess, in that market from a kind of company's perspective to get in and to be part of a real kind of a growing country and a growing population, whereas many other markets in Asia, in the West, etc., that's not always necessarily the case with aging populations and potentially slowing birth rates and things like this. So I think there are ways to kind of frame this, I think, in terms of an opportunity. So I think that's kind of the first response. The second response would be like, sometimes these interventions can be incredibly small and yet still really impactful. So like, I think maybe like the smallest example that I could think of, if you were offering some kind of a discount in a country like Singapore and you wanted to offer a really small level discount, instead of offering a 10% discount, I might offer an 8.88% discount, because the number 8 in Singapore is really auspicious. It's really lucky. And so that would give a sense of being like more localized and maybe like more exciting than a 10% discount. So that's actually even less of a discount, but maybe is like a better discount for that market. So I think that's also something to really like demystify what I mean when I say this. Like when I say I want to build products that are globally inclusive, that doesn't necessarily mean we're building from the ground up a totally different product that's going to look really different in different markets. It just might mean we're changing some words here and there. We're changing a couple of form fields and some of the structures around it. We're changing some of the language that we use. We're not having Zs everywhere. We're having some spelling that's not American, like demystifying it, making it into a series of like small bets, quick wins, experiments. And that can get buy-in, because it's not this like huge change that needs to happen. There's a great opportunity here and we can break it into small chunks. I think you have a greater likelihood of getting this done inside an organization.
Yeah. You brought up a really interesting thing, though, is you're not building this from the ground up. It's not like we have to go build a completely separate app. What can you do within the framework of your current application to not exclude people? Because often it's not even about trying to include them. It's about not excluding them. And I'm thinking off the top of my head, there was a campaign recently, my name's not a typo, right? Where I've got an African name with a lot of, apostrophes or accents that is often going to show up with a red squiggly line. Obviously, that's a system level thing. That's hard for you from a, thing. But then there's also, I remember hearing, maybe this was the same campaign, I can't remember, but, my surname is 2 letters. I'm in China, Xi, for instance, XI. I can't create an account because my last name doesn't have 3 letters, So thinking about that, and it's often, you just made me think of this. It's often not even about including, it's about not excluding them. Going out of your way to include them. It's about how do you keep them from being excluded in the first place. So I don't know. So the naming convention, that's an interesting one that I think is something that probably very easy to fix.
Yeah, I think
Seems
there's
like some random.
Totally. Like I think there's some quick wins in there. Like, the 2-letter surname I think is a really great example, including diacritics. All of these the accents and the marks that go on letters is also like absolutely critical. But I think also the language we use around names is really important. So often you'll see things labeled first name and last name, and that actually isn't necessarily as clear in all cultures as we might expect. So for example, a lot of folks in Japan and maybe in China would use family name and then given name. That would be the order of address. So for example, it's like Abe Shinzo, not Shinzo Abe, is like the preferred term of address for a political leader, right? And that, I think, manifests in UX all the time. Like when you're filling out your name anywhere and it's just first name, last name, I always have this moment of like, which way round? And in Asia, like often I will get emails that are addressed, hi Pryor, because they just go straight for my last name. And that always gives me a moment of like, I mean, why not? Like there is no universal like norm that everyone is going to find suits them. And, maybe in the future, we're going to have like a lot more of these kind of flexible interfaces and flexible communications that are more adaptive. But where you're making one single like broad brush decision for all of your users, you're definitely excluding someone, and someone's going to read that and be like, doesn't feel right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this goes back to the conversation I think that we had with Emily about edge cases, and something that was kind of a topic there was, being the one who's constantly bringing this up, you start to be like a pessimist. And so it's like, how do you say this in a way that like, shows the business value of the pessimism, I guess, in a way, so that you're not the one just always complaining, oh, we always miss this, we always do that. I don't know. It's very hard. It's like it's a fine line to balance, and often I think a lot of designers just get beat down so much that they just stop and they're just like, whatever, I don't care. I tried. You know, which is unfortunate because we're leaving a lot of potential, revenue stream essentially out of the conversation. So I think that's really important. So Ruby, we've been talking for a little bit now. I've got some questions that I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. But before we do that, is there anything else that we didn't get to cover that you think is really critical to this conversation and you want people to know?
I really want everyone to know that a lot of countries around the world use the dollar sign to communicate their currency, and those currencies are very different from each other. So if you are designing an interface that has money involved in it at all, please specify whose dollars you are referring to. Australia uses the dollar, Singapore uses the dollar, New Zealand uses the dollar, Canada, the US, et cetera, et cetera. And it is a huge pain point, I think, for folks from these countries when you're online shopping. And I know for me, often I get sticker shock at the end when it actually hits my credit card and I realize I wasn't browsing in the currency I thought I was. Yeah, because I thought I was looking, when I lived in Singapore, I assumed that I was browsing in Singapore dollars, and an American dollar is like stronger than a Singapore dollar. So it was a very rude shock sometimes when you saw the bill. And this is a real issue. Like in Australia, Airbnb used to have all of their prices in USD, but they didn't make it clear. And they actually got taken to court for this, for misleading advertising, I guess, around their prices, and they got fined a lot of money for it. So it really, really matters. And this is what I mean by questioning these assumptions. And from the get-go, you have to understand that if you have a global audience, they're going to have these different perspectives. So specify. All you needed was to put a USD or a US at the end of that or the start of that, and it would have been super clear. But that's an important one to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's something that I always think about when it comes to just any decision, really. But I think especially in this case is, asking the question, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong? In the case of, you just brought up Airbnb in Australia, what if we're wrong? Well, we could go to get taken to court and be sued millions and millions of dollars. Is it worth not throwing that little character in front of the dollar sign? Can we just do it, And so I'm to one product manager and one designer, there's clearly something that has to happen in a company like Airbnb. But I think if you're not bringing these things up and you're not pushing these up the chain of command, if we don't do it, who is? Who's going to do it if we're not doing it? I don't think, maybe some developers would, I'm sure. Product managers, there's a lot of good product managers out there. Maybe they think of that too. But, I think we can absolutely be a part of that conversation. So Ruby, that's a really great point. We didn't talk about currency. Anything else as far as currency goes that you think is important? Because we didn't really dig into that, but I think that's clearly
yeah, I think on the same thing, like a dollar sign is not a universal denotion of currency. Like in my Gmail, for example, Google is great at pulling out summaries of your emails, right? And often there's a light gray box at the top of the email that has a summary of kind of what's in the email so you don't have to read it. So I got one the other day that was the amount and the delivery date for something that I'd bought online, and Google had extracted this information and put it at the top. And again, I nearly had a heart attack because I had purchased this in baht, and baht uses 1,000 baht. I think USD is maybe $30. So, many more baht per dollar. So I looked at this and I was like, did I just spend $2,000 on something?
Oh my God, right.
But it actually only spent $60. And it was a real moment. And I was like,
right.
Okay, wait a second.
Oh my God.
It's actually fine. But I think when you have this this default programmed in that the default looks like this, we're having US by default, or Northern Hemisphere by default, or English speaking by default, and we're not questioning that and interacting with it, it can cause real moments of stress for your users. So I think on currency, that would be, something else that's really important to consider.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, the importance of just immersing yourself in different cultures and travel. And obviously travel is very expensive. And I say this as someone who has not done an extensive amount of traveling. I've never backpacked across Asia. I've never backpacked across Europe. I only went to Europe and stuff for work because that was the first time I actually got to go to Europe, was because my work paid for it. So I haven't done an extensive amount of traveling. I understand it's very expensive. But if you are young and you can afford to travel and immerse yourself in these experiences, I think one of the best ways to build empathy is to just get out and explore something outside of your own little bubble. And if you have the opportunity and you can afford to do it, I think that's money much better spent than buying a new iPhone or a new gaming system or something like that. That's my personal advice. That's something I would tell my kids. So, anyway, maybe I don't know if you have any interesting thoughts here, but
yeah, the other really awesome empathy building tool is fiction books. And I am a massive advocate of reading fiction. And I think in our world these days, people are so focused on productivity. They always feel like they need to be reading a book that's going to directly teach them the thing. Yeah, the 101 strategy frameworks to change your life. And like, that's great. You know, if you want to read personal productivity and self-help books, like that's awesome. But I think fiction is so incredibly powerful. And there is a large body of research around the role that fiction plays in building empathy. And the mechanism is like, there's something about having space to grapple with someone else's story from their point of view in this book. And it may be totally biased because it's the character's point of view in your own head, in your own time. Like there's something about all of those things coming together that is such a wonderful, wonderful tool for building empathy and building understanding of different cultures. So I totally like echo you, Jeremy. I know travel is not something that is affordable or feasible for so many different people, but I really think like read fiction from diverse authors from regions that you don't usually read from different countries, different places, different genders. Like there is so much amazing stuff that you will absorb through that process. And I think often you absorb and retain a lot more actually from reading fiction. Like the story stays with you better than if you just read like a world history book or a political history book. I think there's something about reading fiction that's really like effective in this exercise.
I love it. Well, stay tuned because I got a question for you about your favorite non-designed book. So don't answer that yet. All right. So Ruby, so this has been awesome. And I think that's a really great tip. If you can't actually make it, you can make it in your head. You can travel in your head and you can travel anywhere, anytime, any place, all from reading a book. LeVar Burton would be singing your praise right now if he was here. That's so awesome. So Ruby, this is awesome. So I got some few questions that I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. First thing that comes to your mind, you don't have to think too hard about it. First up, what is your favorite non-designed book?
This is such a hard question. I'm a voracious reader. I'm going to say like one nonfiction and one fiction. Nonfiction book, I would say Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. I am her absolute number one fan. That book opened my eyes, and I apply that method of like, she talks about the masculine default. That's exactly how I do this thinking around things like Northern Hemisphere default or Western default. Like I think it's such a powerful concept. Love that book. 120% recommend it. When it comes to a fiction book, I'm going to say Babel by R.F. Kuang. It is an amazing book. Like I feel emotional, like even thinking about it. It's one of those books you finish it and then you need to like breathe in and out a couple of times deeply because it's so affecting and so fantastic.
So Babel's the non-fiction or the fiction book.
Yeah.
What is it about?
Fiction.
Is it about language or is it about...
Yeah, sort of. It's about some students at Oxford University. It's kind of like historical magic.
Historical magic. All right. Right on. I love it. Cool. I have to check it out. Yeah, I don't do enough. I'll be honest. I don't do enough reading at all, to be perfectly honest. But fiction, I think, is amazing. I don't read nearly enough fiction. I used to read a lot before I had kids. I like to use them as an excuse. But now I read a lot of books. Like, how do I manage my kid with ADHD? Because I can't. He's insane. In a good way. So anyway, those are the kind of books.
I'd also like super recommend audiobooks.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I need to just start doing audiobooks. I don't know why I'm not doing audiobooks. I think I'd probably be a much better person if I started doing that. All right, what is your favorite non-design podcast? Speaking of podcasts.
Oh, non-design podcast. If Books Could Kill.
What is that about? Is it? I assume it's about some books, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the hosts of that, Michael Hobbs, he has done 3 different podcasts, all of them phenomenal. So he did this podcast, You're Wrong About, and which is great, and then Maintenance Phase, which is also fantastic. And If Books Could Kill is his more recent one. He has a different co-host with all 3 of those podcasts. And in it, they call them like airport books, the kind of book you'd see on an airport shelf. Like there's an episode about Nudge, for example, and they really critically examine these books, the arguments in the methodologies that lead to some of the conclusions in the books. And it's also really funny. It's a great podcast.
Right on. All right. I love a good podcast recommendation. I'm going to check it out. What is your favorite meal? This could be something you've cooked, something your grandma used to cook. Could be something in one of the cities you've traveled to. Favorite meal?
Yeah, I feel like this is so hard. I mean, I love Thai food. Obviously, I'm eating a lot of it right now. I love som tam, which is like a green papaya spicy salad, and green mango salad as well. These like quintessentially Thai flavors, you know, the hot, salty, spicy, sweet all together.
Mhm.
I love that. Huge fan of Thai food.
I love it. Yeah, well, you're in the perfect place for Thai
Yeah.
food. Something most Americans Thai is a similar kind of thing to well, on a smaller scale, I guess. But when you go to like a Thai restaurant in the States, it's usually not very Thai. It's usually with Southern Thai, I think, but Northern Thai, very different. I guess you're in Bangkok, which is, I looked on a map before, it's right in the middle, kind of. So I imagine you get sort of like a Southern and Northern kind of Thai kind of influence, I guess, in Bangkok. But I love Thai food. Yeah, there was a place in Portland, Oregon, called Pok Pok, which was a Northern Thai restaurant. And it was one of the best meals I think I've ever had in my entire life. It was so good. I can't even describe how good it was. It was just like one of my. They had this. I don't know if this is like something they just did or something maybe Thai. They drinking vinegar. Is that something that they drink in?
Oh, I haven't seen that, but maybe
it was like diluted vinegar, but it was sort of like sweet. It was sweetened, but it was sort of sour in a way. And anyway, really good. I don't know. I never had it before. I just assumed that was a Thai thing. I guess it's not. All right. What is your favorite vacation spot?
This is like I feel like a war inside me between like nostalgia and like modern choices. I love Apollo Bay in Victoria, Australia. I used to go there with my family all the time when I was a kid. But I would say maybe Koh Lipe in Thailand. It's one of those islands that the water looks photoshopped. It's so perfectly crystal clear blue, and the sand is like velvet white underneath your feet. Just gorgeous.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah. So back in high school, I read this book called The Beach, which was about this community of, I don't know, misfit travelers that like found this island in Thailand. And it actually ended up being a book, and I think a movie. Leonardo DiCaprio was in it. The movie was not nearly as good as the book. I read the book before the movie came out. But anyway, it was all about like beaches in Thailand and all that stuff. And anyway, when the movie came out, I was like, oh my God, it's so pretty. I wanted to go. And I never made it to Thailand.
Not yet.
Apparently that beach, yes, yeah, exactly. But when the movie came out, that beach got like overrun with tourists and they had to like close it. And they were like, no more tourists, because they actually filmed it in Thailand. Anyway.
Yeah, the new White Lotus is being filmed in Thailand. So there's going to be a huge influx of tourists soon.
Fun. I don't know if that's good or bad. Just as long as they don't destroy anything. All right. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
Oh, great question again. I mean, I feel like saying Fig Jam is going to be a cop out, but I mean, like,
go with Miro if you want.
Yeah, like we've talked about this before in terms of like UX work being so different from Figma and like UI design work. And like I don't use Figma that much in my practice because I'm not a UI designer, and because I've spent so much of my career outside of tech. There's a lot of design work I think that happens outside of building interfaces, particularly in like digital transformation and that kind of like user experience work where I've done most of my career. And often I've just been incredibly tool agnostic, to be honest. Like at the end of the day, my favorite tool has got to be a pen and paper. Like can't beat it for getting unstuck.
Yeah, pen and paper. I love it. That's a good answer. That's one of my favorite answers. All right. Ruby, so this has been really fun. Learned a lot talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on. Before you get out of here, let everybody know where they can find you. Give Rex a plug. Let everybody know if they want to hire you, do some consulting work. Give yourself a plug.
Absolutely. So find me on LinkedIn. That is my main platform. You can find me also on TikTok. I'm at Before Ruby. That's a pun based on my name. You get it? Ruby Pryor, Before Ruby. Yeah.
I get it. It
took
me
really
a second,
but
I love that. Yeah, that's great.
You can also find Rex is rexhq. And we do strategic design and UX research work. I also teach masterclasses in impact sizing, which is kind of methodology where I teach folks how to put that like dollar value on the impact they create. And I also do these kind of extended workshops inside of organizations, helping UX teams articulate how they create value and develop a framework around that and a set of metrics and work with them on the implementation of that as well. So I've done work all over the world and I'm really keen to do more of it. So I'd super love to work with folks who are listening to this podcast. And I do coaching as well. So if you're just an individual working in UX who wants some extra support, maybe you've started a new role and you really want to nail those first 100 days, send me a message, rexhq.io, or find me on LinkedIn and let's chat.
All right. So do that. If you need some help, Ruby is an amazing, amazing person to hire to help you out with all your stuff. So Ruby, thanks so much for coming on. Oh, you know what's funny? I had this thought. So this is like a play on your TikTok before Ruby. I always make these jokes about like cover bands, so like silly cover band names. So the other day I came up with one for No Doubt. If I had a No Doubt cover band, the name I'd call it I Doubt It. That'd be the name of the cover band. So anyway, it's a very similar dad joke, but anyway, it's a good. I like it.
I love it. A good pun is the highest form of humor, really.
You can't beat it. You can't beat it. If I had a good pun joke to talk about puns, I would have used it just now, but I didn't. I didn't have one off the top of my head. I might splice that one in. I might do that. Add that in post production.
Because it would be punishing to force it.
Oh, she did it for me. I don't need to spice it in. You just did it for me. All right, Ruby. I think we're gonna end it there. That's a perfect spot. Ruby, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No worries. I had a great time. Thank you so much, Jeremy.